Welcome, everybody, to the Distilled Spirits Council Ask the Expert webinar series. I am Ross Mulcairn, Director of Member Services and Business Development here at the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, better known as DISCUS. We are recording this webinar so that will be available later on the public DISCUS YouTube channel and in our member portal for our members. For those of you who aren't as familiar, DISCUS is the leading voice and advocate for our members and the distilled spirits industry overall here in the U.S. DISCUS provides a wealth of resources and services to our members and the rest of the industry, including this webinar series that aims to educate and share relevant trends, ideas, resources, discussions, and opportunities. I want to welcome our speakers for today's webinar, Closing the Last Mile, Turning Alcohol Demand into Retail Sales, with Bill Ba and Emma Versoff from Inmar. Emma leads strategy and growth for Inmar Intelligence's adult beverage media and incentive solutions, with more than a decade of experience in retail media, MarTech, and promotions, primarily focused on the adult beverage category. Emma brings deep expertise in navigating complex regulatory environments and connecting incentives, loyalty, and media to drive measurable results for brands and retailers. Bill has been analyzing consumer promotions for more than 20 years. He began his career with VSI Targeting Systems, an industry-leading promotion, targeting, and optimization firm acquired by Inmar in 2005. Today, Bill develops industry-leading trends reports and consumer research, delivering actionable insights to CPG and retail partners. Welcome, Bill and Emma.
Thank you so much.
We are going to talk through some current research that the team at Inmar has done on the beverage alcohol market and what we can take away from new trends and consumer behaviors. We will save some time for Q&A at the end, so please submit your questions as we go in the chat and in the Q&A box, and we will take them at the end. Now, with all that taken care of, Emma, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Awesome. Thanks, Ross. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Bill and I are very excited to share what we've learned. We've put this together to make sure it's not just interesting to listen to, but hopefully it's actually insightful and actionable for your upcoming planning. Before we deep dive into the numbers, I did want to spend just a quick minute walking you through what we're in for today. We're going to start by zooming out and looking at what's happening with consumers overall, not just adult beverage shoppers, but everyday consumers in general, because adult beverage doesn't exist in a vacuum. The exact same people buying spirits, wine, and beer are also buying regular groceries, filling up their gas tanks, paying their bills, and making tough trade-offs across every single category in their lives. Then after that, we'll transition specifically into the adult beverage category and focus really on three major shifts that we're seeing. And throughout all of this, we're not just going to talk about what's happening. We'll also talk about what it actually means for your business, what brands can realistically do about it. So you'll hear a lot from us with the data, and then we'll talk about the strategies you can take away and apply to upcoming campaigns to really help make sense of it all. Here's just a little bit about who we are. Just want to show you the context up front so you understand where we're getting our information and why we're able to share these new insights with you in this space. At Inmar, we've spent over 40 years helping brands and retailers understand shoppers, and probably more importantly, helping them act on that understanding. We sit right at the intersection of retailers, brands, incentives, media, and real commerce data. And through those relationships, we're able to see exactly how consumers discover products, how they plan their shopping trips, how they respond to promotions, and ultimately how they're making buying decisions across a wide range of categories. I just want to give that context up front in just one single up with a bow, and then we'll spend the rest of our time really talking about data and strategy. So with that, we'll jump right in, and I'll hand it over to Bill.
Thanks, Emma. That was a great setup. And thank you, Ross, also. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Excited to be here with you again. I was here last year. We did a webinar in the summer last year with DISCUS. And if you joined us in last year's webinar, then what I'm about to say may feel a little bit familiar, because as Emma mentioned, before we get into the alcohol-specific data, we want to start with some broader shopper trends. And the reason is simple. Many of the behaviors we're seeing in adult beverage don't exist in isolation. They're often part of the larger shifts happening across retail and especially grocery. And a lot of adult beverage purchases, as you know, are purchased along with grocery purchases. And those shifts are changing how consumers make purchase decisions across a wide range of categories, inclusive of adult beverage. So I promise we'll get to a whole bunch of adult beverage shopper data specifically in just a few minutes. But first, let's take a look at what's happening at the broader at grocery shoppers overall. And one of the biggest themes we're seeing right now, we've been talking about, it was something we addressed quite a bit in one of our trends webinars that we do at Inmar, is the concept of intentionality with grocery shoppers. And I think that's in some instances or some cases a better word than price sensitivity, because we all know obviously consumers care about price and it's a hot topic. It has been for a number of years, but it's only part of the story. And in a recent study of grocery shoppers, and when I talk about these studies, we have a lot of transactional data at Inmar, but we also do a lot of shopper insights studies, survey work, talking to shoppers. So I'm going to be referring to a lot of those studies today. And in this case, I'm talking about one where we talk to thousands of grocery shoppers every quarter. And we just talked to them just within the last few weeks. Nearly 70% tell us they're being more careful with their spending, right? And that shouldn't be surprising to anyone. If it is, please tell me where you've been hiding from the news. I would like to go there. But when it comes to the purchases that they actually do make, right, we know they're being more careful with their spending, but they are still buying, 65% say they're more intentional about what they buy, and nearly 60% say they're spending more time looking for incentives and deals for those products. Whether that's, when I talk about incentives a lot today, I'm talking about things like digital coupons, paper coupons, rebates, and other ways to save like those. And they're certainly not just looking for those things, and they're not just looking for ways to save, they're actively doing it. Nearly 2/3 of shoppers tell us these days when they do their weekly shopping for groceries, they're visiting multiple retailers. It's no longer just going to your favorite store. In some cases, people are visiting 3 or 4 or 5 stores. I mean, it's hard to imagine having to go to that many stores to get all of your weekly products, but when prices are so volatile, people are having to do that. And more importantly, in the space that we work in and work with and engage with many adult beverage brands on incentives, 73% tell us they've used digital incentives within the past few months. So couponing, if you're not close to it, isn't just a casual thing among niche shoppers. It's pretty widespread. And that number, 73%, is up from 70% when we did this a year ago. So it continues to grow. And despite, of course, all the attention on digital offers, which is more prominent today, paper coupons are still very much alive. And I know in this category, very much in use on things like neck hangers on bottles and tear pads in liquor stores and places like that. About 54% of shoppers recently told us that they have used digital paper coupons recently. And of course, then we always wonder about younger shoppers versus older shoppers. There is an old school belief that couponing is an older shopper's thing, and it just tends to skew older, and that's actually absolutely not the case at all. And for example, 76% of the highly targeted Gen Z audience and 82% of millennials told us they've used digital coupons recently. So it's prominent. It's interesting that shoppers aren't just trying to spend less; they're trying to spend smarter. And the broader point is that deals and incentives and promotions have become a part of many consumers' shopping strategy, not just something that they're tacking on at the end or casually finding a coupon here or there or a deal. It's a major part of most shoppers' planning strategy today. And of course, the last thing on this slide, we're also continuing to see shoppers switch to save. 43% told us that they've recently switched to a lower price or private label alternative. That's a behavior that we saw really accelerate a few years back after COVID, and when prices started to get high and we had, empty shelves and inflation starting and things like that. We started to see people shifting around, and a lot of people believe that that's activity that shoppers have now learned and they've done it already, and that it's done and they've already made those shifts, but it's not, and they're actively shipping. And these 43% told us these are just on recent shopping trips here within the last few months. And I think it's especially interesting because consumers often tell us that they're loyal, or they think that they're loyal. And of course, many of us all care about brand loyalty and product loyalty, or even retailer loyalty. And many are, or at least they think they are, or at least some of the time, but they're also, more importantly, they're very practical. And when the value equation changes, people become more willing to reconsider the decisions that they may not have reconsidered just a few years ago. So consumers aren't necessarily buying less because of financial pressures. They certainly are, but that's not the only thing they're doing. But they're also evaluating purchases much more carefully. And we've been tracking these behaviors. And as we do that, there's some themes that keep showing up, especially this year. And this was a big piece of a webinar that we did not too long ago. There's these three themes that, and they apply just as much to adult beverage as they do to grocery. The first is health as a filter, and I don't have to tell you guys about health suddenly impacting the category. It's a hot topic among adult beverage, but also among grocery. Consumers are paying more attention to ingredients these days than they did just a few years ago, to quality and long-term benefits on their health, and in some cases their mental health. Second is planning as a strategy. I just started hinting at that a moment ago. People aren't just wandering into the stores and looking around for some deals and hoping to find the best thing. They are actively preparing. They're researching. I mean, we think about groceries and consumables. You don't think about people maybe researching so much, but they are, and they're comparing their price, they're looking for value. And third, loyalty, as we just started to talk about, is becoming more flexible. And consumers certainly still have their favorite brands. I know I certainly do. And, if I was given the choice, if I had the choice, I would certainly buy my preferred products almost every time. But the reality is I'm balancing, our budget and the son about to go off to college and other things, and prices are so high. I can't always buy all of those things. So, a favorite doesn't always mean an automatic purchase. And it's certainly, if there's an opportunity for someone to save money or get more value or try something compelling, loyalty definitely gets tested more today than it did in the past. And I think that's a really important distinction here, is that loyalty hasn't disappeared though, but consumers are becoming more flexible with their loyalty. And when that happens, of course, it also means that opportunities exist for marketers and for brands to show up with the right message and the right value or the right incentive at the right moment. And then Emma, on to you.
Yeah, that is a great foundation to start with. I think it really helps to understand where shoppers' minds currently are. And while the adult beverage category has unique dynamics, it is really being shaped by many of the same forces you just mentioned. Consumers are balancing many more priorities than they have in the past. They're evaluating more options, and with that, making more deliberate decisions. So the challenge for brands is that consumers are no longer evaluating adult beverage purchases through a single lens, or really even through a few lenses. There are several different lenses that they are looking through as they're making their decisions. And they're balancing several competing priorities simultaneously. And that's where we see things really start to get interesting. So something I'll say I've always wanted to say whenever I had dreams of being a news anchor is back to you, Bill.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks. That's right. So let's start digging into adult beverage specific data. So I mentioned we do surveys and research projects. We just very recently, within the last few weeks, ran an adult beverage shopper survey and research study with about 1,000 shoppers. And one of the things we kept seeing throughout the research is that consumers don't all enter the category the same way. Of course, we know that there are shoppers who start with habit. They have brands that they're familiar with, and they tend to begin from a place of comfort and familiarity. And in fact, about 38% of the shoppers that we talked to told us they simply default to the same adult beverage brand when making or planning a purchase. By the way, the people who we talked to in that survey, if you're curious, they are adult beverage shoppers or buyers who have bought recently. They either buy frequently or occasionally. And we also included some folks who previously purchased adult beverages, but may have stopped or significantly reduced their purchases. But the bulk are current buyers who buy with varying levels of frequency. So, there are certainly plenty there who buy with habit, but it's only about 38%. The numbers jump up considerably if we look at shoppers who are researching. Many are starting with research. Nearly 3/4 of shoppers told us they've consulted multiple sources for information or pricing when deciding what adult beverage they're going to purchase. They're exploring products, they're looking for inspiration, talking to friends, checking social content, looking for digital coupon galleries, looking for rebates, and really just across multiple touch points before making a decision. And I mentioned coupons and incentives there in that again, and increasingly consumers are starting with value. A lot of people think of coupons as something you add on, as I mentioned before, but a lot of people start there. And 62% of shoppers told us that promotions and rebates and savings opportunities influence their adult beverage purchase decisions right from the get-go. And that's up, that 62% is up from 50% last year when we did this webinar. So that's a pretty meaningful jump there and a strong indicator that value is becoming more important as an entry point into the category, all the time, each year. And that's where, and of course you have the factors to the right that also come into play, and you guys are certainly familiar with all of those, but it's interesting to see that, price now is a little bit higher in a percentage than even things like taste or quality, which are so important when you're talking about consumables. And the important point is decisions continue to evolve throughout the journey. Even if someone starts with a familiar brand in mind or starts by looking for a deal, that final choice is often shaped by multiple influences along the way. For example, we saw that 1 in 3 consumers are looking for coupons before they enter the store, but they're also looking for them while they're inside the store. So it's not just a pre-shop thing. Shoppers are still actively looking for these discounts while they're browsing the aisles. And you'll see as we continue that the journey doesn't stop really until the cash register rings. There's one point that Emma is going to talk about later that really hits that home. And we're just really kind of teasing that here. And that's why the statistic at the top of this slide is really important, at least in my opinion. 64% of consumers tell us that they're inspired to purchase by an occasion or an interest, right? No surprise there, but they don't choose the actual product or brand until much later. In other words, consumers often begin with a reason to buy or an inspiration to buy, but the specific brand decision happens much further down the road. And we'll talk about that quite a bit throughout this presentation. What all this tells us is that the categories become far more dynamic than some people may want to assume or believe, and consumers are more willing to explore and more willing to switch, and often making decisions, as I said, later in the journey. And they're also responding to a broader range of influences than they were just a few years ago. And the result is a purchase journey that looks very different than it once did. And there's some behavioral shifts, 3 of them that we're going to talk about throughout most of the rest of the presentation that kind of rise to the top as we continue to analyze the data. And those shifts really do form the foundation here of what we're going to talk about. And I'll hand over to Emma here to help explain how consumers are reshaping engagement within the category.
Great. So we wanted to share all of that to just really set the stage of how consumers have become more intentional, how they're balancing more priorities, and then how the purchase journey itself is really evolving. And now we'll focus on 3 trends that are reshaping engagement within the adult beverage category specifically, and then what you as marketers can do in response. So before we dive into those trends, I wanted to start here. This is to frame up the rest of our conversation today. I want to just leave with one statistic that has completely changed how I think about this category. So when we asked consumers whether they consistently buy the exact same adult beverage brand every time, the average was only 24%. So as Bill was saying earlier, that doesn't mean that consumers don't have favorite brands. Most of us do. But having a favorite brand and purchasing the exact same product every time are 2 very different things. And what this shows is that there's still a tremendous amount of openness inside this category. Consumers are incredibly willing to explore and consider alternatives, and they're very open to trying something different when the circumstances are right. That is incredibly encouraging from a marketing perspective. It could be a little troubling if your sole focus is loyalty, just based on the flexibility of loyalty that we were just talking about. But what it means is there are massive opportunities to drive trial, and influence a shopper's decisions. The real challenge and probably the biggest opportunity is understanding which consumers are the most open and what actually motivates them to take the leap. So we'll dive into the trends. The first one is the category engagement divide. Because when we started digging into the data, one thing became very clear to us. Consumers might be buying from the exact same category, but they are not participating in that category the same way. Some shoppers are actively looking for information and inspiration before they buy, while others are kind of just relying on habits they've developed over the years. Some might be purely motivated by value. On the flip side, others are driven by the occasion. So because of that, making broad assumptions about consumers within this category is just not useful. So what we're seeing is a category where different consumers are following very different paths to arrive at similar purchases. So if you as brands want to connect with them, we need to understand the different journeys first. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we go through these trends. that whether we look at discovery behavior, trial, brand switching, or how people respond to promotions, consumers consistently showed a much greater willingness to explore than conventional category wisdom would show. Adult beverage is often discussed as a highly loyalty category, but while there's certainly loyalty, there's also a significant amount of openness, which opens up a ton of opportunity for you.
That's right. Thanks, Emma. And that was a good foundation and a good perspective to really kind of shape how we're going to go forward with this. So for the second year in a row, as I mentioned, we conducted this adult beverage shopper survey and study. We did the same thing last year for this webinar. And one of the things that showed up consistently in the data was that consumers don't all discover the same adult beverage products the same way. So we started looking at discovery and how do people find new products and what influences them along the way. And there's a whole bunch of things that we looked at. We certainly can't cover them all today. We cherry picked a few here, but the first thing that jumped out is just how active consumers are during the discovery process. As we called out earlier, nearly 3/4 say they're consulting multiple sources and doing their research before deciding what to buy. But not every touch point behaves the same way. So if we take social influence, for example, or social influencers and media, it plays a particularly important role among younger shoppers, probably no surprise there. And in fact, when it comes to discovery of adult beverage products, it reaches about 20% of consumers ages 21 to 24 and about 18% of consumers 25 to 34. When I say reaches, that's the percentage of shoppers who told us that they were influenced by social in terms of discovery and of adult beverage product. And so for those audiences, social platforms and creators have become a really meaningful discovery channel. When we look at incentives instead, for example, and again, I'm talking about things like coupons or rebates and those types of promotions, they influence discovery much more consistently across age groups, making them one of the few touch points with a more broad cross-generational reach. Coupons, rebates, and promotions continue to influence discovery regardless of beverage preference, with relatively consistent results across the category. Yeah, when we filter it by beverage type, actually, it's much more consistent. We have that if somebody wants to see it. But so it's not so much about the type of beverage, but just the vehicle itself. And it's worth noting that this isn't trivial. When we looked across beverage types specifically, roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of consumers say these types of promotions are playing a role in their discovery, regardless of which type of adult beverage we looked at. And I think that's really important because discovery isn't happening through a single channel. Different consumers respond to different influences, which means brands need multiple pathways to reach consumers as they move through the purchase journey, and marketers need to tailor certain discovery strategies to specific audiences, while others can work more broadly and effectively across a portion of the category. So once consumers discover, right, the next question is, are they actually going to try? Are they actually going to buy something, or what's influencing trial? And one of the things that stood out in this research is just how much openness, as Emma mentioned a minute ago, exists within the category. And this is actually something consumers across all segments we looked at agreed on, much like the appreciation for savings. Adult beverage is often, as we said, described as a highly loyal category, but to be fair, there is some loyalty here, but there's a really surprising amount of exploration. More than 3/4 of consumers told us they don't always purchase the same brand. It's kind of the flip of the way we were talking about it a minute ago. And nearly 3/4 have recently tried a product that was either newly released, like a true new item, or something that was simply new to them. Maybe they just hadn't purchased it previously. And those are some pretty significant numbers, obviously. And I think they suggest that loyalty today may look a little different than it did in the past. I think in the conflict is, right, that I mentioned before, consumers tell us they're loyal, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're purchasing the same brand every time anymore, which is what we all used to strive for with loyalty. So for many shoppers, loyalty may mean now having a subset of brands or a small set of brands that they trust and enjoy, and then rotating among those options depending on the occasion or what's available, what sounds good at the moment, or more importantly, what the prices look like at any given moment. And so I think, if consumers are maintaining a consideration set rather than a single preferred brand, the objective may not always be then to try to desperately be the only choice, because it's really, really hard to win that these days. And it may be rather that you want to try to desperately remain within their choices of brands. So staying in front of them and keeping top of mind. And that's why discovery trial promotions and ongoing engagement continue to matter so much because consumers have their favorites, but they're also continuing to explore. And that creates so many opportunities for brands to stay visible, stay relevant, and stay within the consumer's consideration set. And of course, promotions, we talk about that a lot because we're very close to them in the work that we do. They really frequently help drive that exploration. More than half of adult beverage consumers tell us that a coupon or a rebate changed their adult beverage purchase decision that they've made recently within the last few months. And that number continues to grow. And among consumers whose purchases were influenced, what does that mean? 43% of them said they tried a beverage type for the first time because of a coupon. 37% tried a new brand. 27% tried a different flavor or variety. So it's shaping this trial. It's getting people to try those things. It's getting them over the hump. So promotions don't simply, change which product gets purchased. It's actually getting people to try things that they haven't tried before, and encouraging them to purchase across a variety. And the final piece of this trend is value. And then we'll move on to some other things. One of the questions we wanted to answer was what consumers actually do when they're presented with the opportunity to save. And so value. And what stood out immediately is that promotions are much more likely to drive exploration than they are to, say, drive a permanent switching between brands. Across every age group, consumers were far more likely to tell us that they tried a new product or a brand as a result of an incentive than that they switched away from a brand or a preferred brand on a more permanent basis. And so I think that's an important thing to consider, that promotions aren't necessarily replacing loyalty. Quite often they're just expanding consideration. They're giving consumers a reason to try something new while maintaining the brands and products that they already knew and trust. And of course, if you're thinking about it on the other side of not just trial, but what else do they do? Of course, promotions also help with loyalty as well. Approximately, it's not on the screen here, but approximately 45% of shoppers aged 21 to 34, obviously a real target audience, said that coupons have influenced them to buy more of a product than they normally would, or to buy it sooner. So some people always worry that, well, coupons are just subsidizing, right? I'm just going to give away something that I was give a discount to somebody who was already going to buy. But significantly, most shoppers tell us it does change their purchase in some way. So it's much less about subsidization and more about either driving trial or getting people to buy more or sooner. And looking ahead to the future, that behavior does not appear to be going away. Among those shoppers, which we've already told you are a majority, who are using coupons and incentives for adult beverage purchases, 95% of them tell us they're either going to continue to use them at the same rate or they need to increase them over the next 6 months. So if there's a broader takeaway from this trend, it's that value remains one of the most reliable ways to drive engagement, whether that's discovery, trial, or accelerating purchase behavior. Okay, and then this one's interesting. This is one of the more interesting ways we spun the data. And it wasn't really about a demographic story or anything like that. It wasn't about comparing Gen Z to boomers or high income to low income shoppers or anything like that. Those differences certainly exist, and you guys already know a lot of that information. But what we wanted to do was understand how consumers are participating in the category. And so we developed this framework based on behaviors, and you can see some of them here on the screen, such as information seeking or multiple touch points, openness to promotions or willingness to try, or where decisions are being placed, and then ranked people on how much they use those. And what emerged were these three groups, right? And it's low, medium, or high engagement. You can see the share of adult beverage shoppers who fit into those, about 20, 43, or 38%. And the ones to the right are the ones that are most interesting. That was 4 out of 10 adult bev consumers fall into that engagement. And these consumers actively explore the category. They're comparing options. They're seeking information. They're remaining open to influence all the way through the purchase discovery or journey. And what we thought was most interesting for the audience today here is that when we look at the spirits shoppers specifically, more than half of recent spirits purchasers, and that's 52% of those shoppers who told us they bought spirits recently, fall into this category on the right, this highly engaged segment, compared to 39% of all beverage shoppers. In other words, spirits consumers are disproportionately represented among the shoppers who are most actively exploring, comparing, or responding to recommendations and promotions and other influences along the path to purchase. So the implication there is that growth isn't only about reinforcing loyalty, it's also about identifying and activating those moments where consumers are actively exploring the category and looking for what's next. And that's a lot of shoppers in the spirit space. All right, so Emma, I've talked a lot here, so let's throw it back over to you. We've explored this idea of the category divide a little bit. So, what do we do about this?
Yeah, thank you. As someone who has worked adjacent to this category for quite some time, I always find it so interesting and helpful to hear how shoppers are approaching the category in such unique ways. And I think one of the biggest things that's important is to keep in mind that everyone on this call, we're all consumers ourselves. Like Bill, Ross, and I think we probably, the three of us, shop a little differently from each other. Maybe not, who knows? I would say we probably do. But it really
Probably.
emphasizes that when shoppers show up differently, we as marketers really have to do the same. People aren't following a single path into a category anymore. They're discovering products on their own way. They're open to trial for different reasons, and then they're responding to different definitions of value. So, first, we need to move beyond simple demographic targeting. Understanding behavior has become just as important, if not even more important, than understanding who your shopper, who your consumer is on paper. And brands that are most successful here aren't simply asking like who their consumers are. They're identifying who those consumers are through specific behaviors, their motivation, their purchase patterns, and then putting them into different distinguished consumer groups. So the more clearly you see those behaviors, the easier it really becomes to find opportunities for discovery, for trial, and for engagement. Second, brands need to reach consumers through multiple discovery pathways. Some consumers will respond to savings, while others are looking for recommendations through advertising, social content, or in-store experiences. And the goal isn't to force everyone down the same path. It's to make sure your brand is discoverable across all paths and across all different ways people, especially the people you're trying to reach, engage with this category. Lastly, we have to create connected experiences across all of these touch points. Consumers don't experience discovery, consideration, and purchase as completely separate stages. They experience this as one single journey. So the more connected to those experiences you are, and the more connected each step along that journey is, the more effectively you can move a shopper from just initial awareness to trial and conversion. Which is, I think, a perfect transition to our next trend. The first was talking about how consumers engage in the category. Now let's talk about how they're participating in it. If you followed the beverage industry over the last few years, which I'll make an assumption that everyone on this call has,
I would
you've
hope so.
probably seen plenty of discussion around moderation, wellness, non-alcoholic options. Is Gen Z drinking more? Are they drinking less? How is Gen Z engaging in the category? And when we look at the data, there's definitely evidence that a lot of those trends are real. But what we have found is that the story is a bit more nuanced than simply saying consumers are drinking less. In many cases, consumers aren't leaving the category, they're just becoming more flexible in how they navigate it. So we'll take a look at what is actually happening within the category, how they're participating in it. We can shift to, yeah, perfect. There's really no question that some, strong emphasis on the some, consumers are pulling back right now. Roughly 40% tell us that they're purchasing less frequently, they're reducing their quantity, or they're changing their buying habits in some way. That could be based on health concerns, moderation goals, economic pressures. All of those things are playing a role. And they're not just hypothetical trends. You can clearly see them in the numbers because almost 40% are also citing inflation and affordability challenges as the main reason they're cutting back. So our fun fact here is that when shoppers feel like they have to remove items from their cart to manage costs, 1 in 3 are pulling adult beverages back on the shelf. It is, I would say, probably seen as like a nice to have whenever you are a bit more budget conscious than a need to have. But it's really not just about the money. A third also tell us that they're drinking less because of health or nutritional concerns. But what really stands out to me is that all of these numbers point back to shoppers becoming much more intentional about their choices. They're evaluating purchases more carefully, thinking differently about social settings, and making much more deliberate decisions than they did a few years ago. If we stop the story right here, it would be super easy to assume that people are simply leaving adult beverage behind. But we didn't believe that. So we looked a little bit deeper into the research and we found a completely different reality that I think is a lot more interesting. So I will pass it back to Bill to chat through zebra striping.
Yeah, and actually, before we hop off the slide, that not so fun fact that we tucked in there in the middle on the right, harkens back to what I said earlier, is that the path, the shoppers, you really, sorry, it's lost my train of thought there. It's really, you really don't know what's going to be purchased until the register rings. That's where I was going. Sorry, I mentioned it earlier, is that the path to purchase doesn't stop once somebody's even put the product in the cart. I mean, we're seeing shoppers pulling things out of their cart still to save. And so you really, and so what are they going to take out of the cart and what's the best deal that time? A promotion can help to keep that product in the cart instead of something else, and they'll remove something else. So sorry. So, the interesting story that Emma just mentioned, and what is that? Nearly half of consumers tell us they're switching between alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages within the same occasion. And that's where this term zebra striping comes in. Consumers aren't necessarily choosing one side or the other. They're moving back and forth between the two depending on the moment. And then to make it more interesting is most consumers purchasing non-alcoholic products, and in this case, we're talking about non-alcoholic, alternatives, are absolutely still purchasing alcohol as well. Among non-alcoholic purchases, 86% are also buying wine, 86 are also buying beer, and another 80 are also buying spirits. So the story suddenly it changes. Instead of seeing consumers leave the category, we're seeing many consumers participate in it differently. They're mixing alcohol and non-alcohol products, adjusting consumption levels, and making different choices in different situations, which naturally leads to the next question: is if they're not leaving the category, what's driving all of this back and forth? What's in all this back and forth behavior? And Emma, I think you've got an opinion on that.
I do, yes. Would love to take over here. So when we have asked consumers why they're moving back and forth between alcohol, NA options, functional beverages, alternative options, the answers were not primarily about abandoning alcohol altogether. They were simply about managing the specific moment. So of course, yes, health and wellness definitely show up in the data, but they're really only one piece of the story. More than half of the consumers tell us they're simply trying to moderate consumption. They're trying to drink responsibly and avoid overconsumption. Others point directly to a social setting, the time of day, or the length of the event, like longer afternoon gatherings, where maybe you want to pace yourself and switch between alcohol and NA options throughout the day. And what this tells me is really that the decisions are very often situational rather than permanent lifestyle choices. The zebra striping concept is that most baskets that have an NA option or an alternative option are also having a beverage alcohol option in there as well. So that exact same consumer may be making a completely different choice depending on where they are, who they're with, how long the occasion lasts, or what they have planned for afterwards. And that lines up with what we're seeing more broadly across consumer behavior as well right now. Consumers are increasingly organizing their decisions around experiences and occasions rather than just direct product categories. So whether it's a social gathering, a sporting event, a festival, a night out, or in with friends, the context is often becoming just as important as the product itself. And I'll share as well that I think maybe the pressure to have alternative options at social gatherings continues to increase. So having something beyond just a sparkling water and lime or a Shirley Temple for those who don't indulge. And I think that's why it's much more useful for us to think about occasions rather than just strict rigid categories. Consumers aren't necessarily changing who they are. They're really adapting their choices to fit the context that they're in for that time. So that's a huge distinction for marketers because the opportunity isn't simply understanding what consumers drink, it's understanding the moments they're navigating and figuring out how your brand can remain relevant within these specific moments. So we'll share an example about what can we do about this. This is all really great, insightful data, but what can we be done? Um, Brands, I think, need to think a little bit differently about how they approach consumers. So if you have people who are moving between alcohol and alternative options, depending on the situation, then organizing your brand application around these occasions and motivations becomes just as important as organizing around products or audience segments. So the first recommendation that you see here on this slide is about understanding that moment. So whether the consumers are celebrating, entertaining, moderating, exploring, or simply spending time with their friends, those motivations create direct opportunities for brands to show up with more relevant messaging and experiences. The second piece here in the middle is making sure creative offers and media all align with that consumer mindset. The same consumer may be looking for something completely different depending on the occasion. So understanding that context becomes incredibly important. Like the example I shared on the previous slide, a night in with the girls, you may be buying a bottle of wine. A larger hosting, you're probably buying wine, cases of beer, maybe some alternative options. So understanding the planning that that consumer is doing is so important. And then lastly, brands really need to maintain visibility, like we were sharing across that entire journey. Consumers move fluidly between products, formats, occasions, and that means that brands that stay present across each of those different moments are often the ones that are most likely to remain part of the consideration set. And we're seeing this idea play out far beyond adult beverage. Some of the largest media and social platforms are increasingly organizing experiences around cultural moments, live events, creators, and communities because consumers want to participate in these moments. They don't just want to consume static content. And I think the same principle applies here that brands that understand the occasion and show up in ways that feel relevant to that moment are often going to be the brands that win that moment. And I'll shift it back to Bill.
Great stuff. Yeah, thanks. So throughout today so far, we've talked a lot about planning and consumers researching more and thinking about occasions and options, and they're spending much more time making decisions. But one thing we keep seeing in the data is that planning doesn't necessarily mean the decision is final, which is what I was also talking about a few minutes ago. In many cases, consumers may know they want to purchase alcohol. They may want to purchase an adult beverage category product. They know what type of product they're looking for, but what they haven't always decided is exactly which product they're going to buy. And that distinction turns out to be pretty important because it means that there are still so many opportunities along the way to influence decisions much later in the journey than there might be for other types of products or categories. So let's take a look at some of those, where those decisions are being made. And this is a pretty interesting story, is that when we ask consumers about their decision-making process, what we found was that many arrive at the store having already decided the category they want to purchase, and that's great. They know they want to buy beer, or they want to buy wine, or they want to buy spirits, or perhaps an RTD beverage. But what they're often still deciding is the specific product, right? They're not writing down that brand name on their shopping list. They're writing down beer or spirits or more vodka or whatever it is, or wine. And in fact, more consumers tell us they decide the brand or the product in store than before they ever walk through the door. So while the category decision often happens before shopping, the brand decision frequently happens much later. And I think that's important because it tells us that planning and decision making aren't necessarily the same thing. Consumers may have intent before they shop, but that doesn't mean that the competitive battle is over. And in many cases, they're still evaluating all these options that we've been already talking about and making these final decisions once they're standing right in front of the products at shelf. And that's actually pretty encouraging, again, because it means that influence doesn't stop once a consumer decides that they want to purchase. And in many cases, only where the next stage of, that's only where the next stage of the decision making begins. And the next thing we wanted to understand then was how open those decisions remain once the consumers reach the shelf. And the answer is very open. More than 80% of consumers tell us, and these again, reminder, adult beverage shoppers tell us they're still deciding between options at least some of the time when they reach the shelf. And roughly 40% tell us this happens almost all the time or very often. So this isn't just an occasional behavior for a lot of shoppers. You know, for a meaningful portion of consumers, comparison shopping is a normal part of the process, right down to that last minute in the store. And we see a similar pattern, you know, with the in-store influence. More than 80% tell us that shelf presence impacts their decision, which means visibility, merchandising, presentation, and all those things do still continue to matter right up until that moment of purchase. Those things are still having an impact. And when we asked what ultimately influences the final decision, the answers were fairly straightforward. Price and promotions showed up first, followed by brand familiarity, visibility, and packaging. And none of those are particularly surprising on their own, but what's important is where they're happening in that final moment before conversion.
And
Emma,
Bill,
back over to
I'm
you.
gonna steal one more slide from you.
Okay.
I really wanted to cover this one because it's telling us that flexibility doesn't only exist among consumers who walk into the store undecided. It also exists among consumers who thought they had already made a firm decision. So a personal example, you know, I shared I've worked adjacent to the category for a long time, but within the last couple of years, I actually stopped consuming beverage alcohol. And so I'm very interested in all of the alternative options that we have. And I feel like I go to the store with a mindset that like I am going and I will be buying athletic. And then I go there and there's like 3 more alternative options that I hadn't seen before. So I'm often leaving with athletic and something else or completely something else. And nearly 2/3 of shoppers tell us they have similar experiences and are switching brands in stores. So even if they have a specific brand in mind, before they start shopping, they're not leaving the store with them. And availability and price certainly matter here, but they're really not the only reason consumers change course at the shelf. So, like I was sharing, many consumers tell us they switch simply because they saw a new product that caught their attention or something stood out visually, whether that be packaging or a display, signage, or promotion. And to me, that's a really important reminder to all of us that discovery doesn't stop when consumers enter the store. In many cases, it's still happening when they're right there in front of the shelf, in front of products. And so I think conversion is less of an isolated moment and much more of a continuous process. Consumers continue evaluating options much later in the journey than I think a lot of us assume. And so there's still great opportunities to influence the outcome even after a shopping trip has already begun. And what do we do about this one? We can advance to the next.
Did it
I
advance?
think.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, perfect. The biggest takeaway from this trend is that influence doesn't stop at awareness. So what Bill showed us is that many consumers are still actively evaluating options really late into the journey, essentially up to the point of conversion. And so the first recommendation on this slide is about maintaining visibility beyond awareness. Brands need to stay relevant through consideration, shopping, and purchase moments, not that just initial phase of discovery. The next recommendation is really about understanding where decisions remain open. The category purchase data can be incredibly valuable here because it helps identify where consumers are switching, where they're hesitating, and where they're most receptive to influence. And those insights help brands make much smarter activation decisions. So an example is they inform where retail media investments will have the biggest impact, whether that's reaching consumers early in consideration, reinforcing choices throughout the journey, or identifying the exact spots where brand switching is most likely to happen. And that's also one of the reasons why retailer partnerships have become increasingly more important. Through Inmar's growing network of retail partners, brands gain a much broader view of consumer behavior and more opportunities to engage shoppers at critical decision points. We're actually super excited here to preview, I think, for the first time that Sam's Club is soon coming to our list of Inmar retailers. The rest of the list you can see here up on the slide, but really excited to share that with this group. Finally, Measurement and evaluating performance across the full journey is really what matters. Consumers are interacting with multiple touch points, like we talked about, before they purchase. The journey, it's definitely not linear, but I think they're ping-ponging back and forth so many times between different touch points. So you really want to make sure you understand which are actually driving conversion, driving incremental sales, and driving repeat purchases. So the goal isn't to just generate activity, it's to understand what's influencing this behavior and what will deliver real business results for your brand. Because if the last mile is where many decisions are still being negotiated, then understanding, influencing, and measuring those moments becomes one of the most valuable things that a brand can do. And I'll close it out with this case study. I think it's a great example of what we've been talking about. The goal was to drive sales for each of the brands around highly relevant seasonal moment for tequila, Cinco de Mayo, and then just the broader spring entertaining season in Southern California. What I think is really cool about this example is it wasn't built around a single isolated tactic. It wasn't just simply an awareness campaign, and it wasn't just an incentives and promotion strategy. Instead, this program was designed entirely around understanding the ideal consumer, understanding the occasion, and showing up at the exact moments when consumers were likely to be making decisions. So the campaign had a combination of geo-targeting, custom creative, highly relevant moments of receptivity to connect with shoppers when these brands were most likely to fit what they were already planning to do. These results were incredibly strong, with over 1 million in incremental sales, a 17% sales lift, and then nearly $10 million worth of products added to carts. I think those stats are impactful, but the biggest takeaway is why this works, why it worked, and that's that it aligned perfectly with the behaviors that we've been discussing throughout the last 45, 50 minutes. Consumers were already planning occasions, they were already evaluating options, and they were remaining open to influence throughout their journey. And this campaign simply met them where they were with the right message at the right moment.
It's fantastic results, Emma. It's really great.
Yeah, so to wrap it up, we'll leave you with the 3 core opportunities that emerge from everything that we've discussed today. And I think not to be like super repetitive, but it's just behaviors are most important, not just demographics. That is what is dictating the category divide. It's telling you so much more about your ideal consumer beyond what they look like on paper, and helps you understand how they discover products, what's motivating them, and how to engage with them. The next one is the cultural shifts and occasional moderation is really owning the consumer mindset right now. The category is being shaped by changing occasions, changing consumption contexts, and what we found, it's not just a story of consumers leaving adult beverage behind. It's a story of consumers making just much more intentional situational decisions. And then lastly, flexibility and visibility are really what's going to win at the final moment, the shelf. Visibility is obviously still important, it still matters, but where and when it matters has changed. Many of the purchase decisions remain open until much later in the journey. I think we've probably, the word cloud of this webinar would have flexibility, I think probably
Yes.
right there in the middle. But they're making a lot more decisions much later in the journey. So really the one thing that connects all 3 of these opportunities is flexibility, and that consumers are still remarkably open to influence. They're exploring, evaluating, and discovering within the category. The brands that understand those behaviors are really going to be the brands that win. Yeah, I'd love to take questions. I really appreciate you guys spending time with us today. We do have a QR code here. So when we start to look at the questions coming in, you can take a moment to scan the code. It will share your info, and then a consultant from Inmar will reach out for just a quick consultation to understand your business goals. And then from there, we provide a complimentary shopper insight snapshot, which provides data and insights into the category and can just help you identify opportunities to drive trial, increase volume, and then build loyalty. So while you're scanning that, we can take some questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Bill. Everyone, please go ahead and submit your questions in the chat. I know we've got a few coming in already, but I want to make sure we get everyone's answers while they can. And go ahead and scan the QR code to connect with the Inmar team directly or reach out to us, membership@distilledspirits.org, and we can connect you with the team there if you have any specific questions for us or for them. One of the questions that came in as you guys were talking about sort of that zebra striping and the NA versus beverage alcohol behaviors is when a consumer is choosing to sort of pace themselves to implement zebra striping or to change their purchasing behavior, if a brand doesn't have a non-alcoholic brand in their portfolio, if they just have their own products, how do they ensure that they are still remaining in that product and they're not losing out their own personal share to someone when they're choosing to pace themselves?
Sure. So
Yeah.
I think zebra striping, what is most interesting about these changes in behaviors is that baskets are including both. So you still have the opportunity to win when someone is buying NA options because it's very rare that NA is just the only thing in their basket. And then Bill, I don't know if you wanted to add into anything else there.
No, I think that's probably more of your expertise in the adjacent space, but I mean, if you don't have a non-alcoholic option in your portfolio, I think then it's it's thinking about when they're, they may want to consume that product at a later time. For example, if they're pacing themselves now, but they may want it later. So keeping it top of mind for them, or that they purchase for a different occasion and providing an incentive or some reason for them to do so.
Okay. And I just saw one come in, and Bill, this might be your area of expertise. When we're talking about the in-store decision making, have you seen any difference in terms of, the in-store promotion itself, messaging at the shelf versus a point of sale versus a floor display or anything like that?
That's a tricky question. I mean, all of those things are going to perform. If somebody's asking about performance, they're all going to perform differently. And I'm trying to think of how to answer that question. I mean, we certainly see. I think one thing that's really interesting is the may not be exactly answering the question, but it's related, is the increase in the growth of at-shelf engagement. In the past, that was always paper promotions, a tear pad or, a blinking machine spitting something out. And more we see shoppers engaging through QR codes, looking for digital incentives. That can be, especially in this space, that can be a coupon in certain markets or a rebate in other markets where you're not allowed to give a coupon. It can lead to a rebate. But we've seen at a national level, not just among adult bev shoppers, but among all shoppers, is that more than 50% have told us that they have engaged with those QR codes right at shelf and have successfully redeemed some type of an offer and incentive. So we're seeing the growth of that, and the performance of those types of offers certainly grow a bunch. So QR code discovery is definitely emerging and growing fairly rapidly.
Awesome. And we also had a question that I was curious about, and I'm combining a couple here because I know we're close up on time. When we're targeting, a social occasion or, a behavioral choice with a digital advertising, or, someone who's interested in responsibility or moderation, what sort of data are you guys using to figure out what's the right way to target that consumer with that behavior mindset or with that, attitude rather than, just a traditional brand loyalty?
Yeah, Emma, does that relate back to some of the stuff you guys did with that case study example, or how you guys are targeting those things?
Sure. I think really a lot of it is just understanding the specific moment, what you're trying to go after, what your goal of the campaign is. But I think especially as the option for alternative options, the option or the conversation about moderation continues to grow. I think it'll be interesting to see. I don't know if we have a specific study on how that worked, but it's something that we do take into consideration in entirely setting up targeting for campaigns.
Okay. Now, I know we're right up on time, so I've got one question left, but before we let everyone go, we have more webinars coming up in the next few weeks. So my colleague is going to be dropping in some chats. 2 weeks from now, we are talking to Alan Barbet from Validate Advisory about unlocking cash and value in a complex market. And then a week later, on July 2nd, we'll be talking with Proof 8 about aging barrels and managing your assets there. So that's just wanted to make sure we got everyone in there. This was wonderful. We want to have you guys there. And then my last question before we let you guys, Bill and Emma, go. If you are a premium brand and customers are making last second decisions, in a tough market, what can they be doing to make sure that even if they get in the cart, they're not being taken out at the last second and replaced with a cheaper option? What should our higher level brands, because a lot of spirits brands are more premium, more expensive, what can they do to make sure that they get in the cart and stay in the cart all the way through to the end and are not just getting replaced with a cheaper option?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a challenge, right? And there isn't one necessary answer for that. But I think having, a high quality or valuable incentive can do that. And what's interesting, we actually had a stat in the survey about this specifically, because there's a concern sometimes among premium brands of whether or not offering a coupon or incentive will cheapen how people view or perceive that brand. And what we found, we asked that specifically. We asked about premium, mid-tier, and low-price brands, and then the perception if those brands were to issue a high-value coupon or something. And the overwhelmingly, shoppers said that they would actually feel stronger about the brand or feel appreciative, and very, very few said that they felt like that would cheapen the brand or decrease their perception of the brand. So I think some of those top shelf brands who might have a concern or reluctance of are coupons right for me? Is that going to cheapen my brand? Consumers tell us absolutely not. Among these, very, very few said that. I think people appreciate the help these days as opposed to days of old where it wasn't as necessary, and that might have been viewed as an activity that didn't align with the brand. So that can certainly help. I mean, I don't think there's one foolproof option, but certainly, again, staying engaged, communicating on multiple touch points, and then having the right type of offer or communication that's going to keep it top of mind can certainly help.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure many consumers are looking at these top shelf items and saying, I would love to try it one day. And now you've given them an excuse to, instead of walking past it and telling themselves they're going to, they're actually going to do it today.
Exactly. I mean, we even see, among, I know we're going over, but if it's of interest, when we look just in shoppers in general, high household income shoppers tend to skew higher for coupon usage as well. So a lot of people think that coupon usage might be used among a certain demographic or a type of lower income houses. We actually see massive amounts of coupon usage among households who are making over $100,000 or more of household income per year, or 150,000 or more. So it's not associated. Couponing is not associated with cheap or anything like that, or low income or any of those things. It's associated with, hey, this brand is trying to help me out and afford this product.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, I know we're over time, so thank you everyone who has stuck around for the last couple of minutes. And I want to especially thank Emma and Bill and the whole team at Inmar. You guys have been wonderful. This has been super helpful. I've found it interesting, and I'm sure all of our members have as well. For anyone who registered and did not get a chance to attend, we will be sending out the recording of this to all of our registrants. And I just want to say thank you to Emma, Bill, the team at Inmar, and to all of our members at Discus. We will see you guys all in the next few weeks. And thanks, everybody. We'll see you around.
Okay, guys, thanks for having us.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks, everyone.